Hey, what's going on everyone, and welcome back to the Bimmer barn. Today we're going to be working on my E60 550i and doing the alternator gasket seal replacement. This is a common N62 problem. You'll notice it leaking oil down the side of the motor, and we're going to be replacing the associated seals today, as well as doing an oil change. Now, before we get into the video, I just want to say if you enjoy this sort of content, be sure to leave a like for me and subscribe if you're new to the channel. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into the video. Now in front of me, you'll see all the parts that we're going to be using to do this service today. Some of the stuff is going to be necessary, like the gaskets and the seals themselves, but some of the stuff is going to be additional. Like, you don't need to do an oil change when you service this gasket. I'm just going to do one because it's going to keep things a little bit cleaner, and you don't need to replace your alternator, although we're going to be replacing this one preventatively. So let's go ahead now and get over to the car and talk about some of the things that we'll need to do in order to get this job done successfully. Now, in order to replace the alternator gasket seal, you can see I have the motor cover off already. Of course, we have to remove the alternator, but the alternator bracket, which is what has the seal up against the engine block, it's actually also tied into the motor mount on this side. So not only do we have to remove the alternator and the power steering pump is going to dangle in place, but we do have to remove the motor mount and the motor mount arm, and then we'll have access to the alternator gasket. So in order to do that, we have an engine support bar, and this is going to help us lift up the motor from this hook right here, which is what it's made for. And usually you would drop the subframe to get enough access, but I've seen a couple of tricks where we might be able to just lift the motor up here and then remove the motor mount arm without ever touching the subframe. And since that would save us a lot of time, I think we're going to try that first, and hopefully it'll work out. So now let's go ahead and begin by removing the intake, this cover right here, and then we'll remove the electric fan, and that should give us enough room to see and work on the alternator so we can remove it and get to work on getting that seal replaced. And of course, since we're going to be working on the electrical system of the car, it's vital that we unplug the battery. So let's go ahead and start off by doing that first, and then we'll start disassembling the motor. For the air intake pipe, you just need to remove the MAP sensor and then loosen the hose clamps on either side. If you have the factory airbox, you might have to remove the whole thing, and I ended up doing so here on camera just to give you guys the best angles. But once that's out of the way, you need to worry about this upper cover for the fan. It has a ton of T30 screws on it. Remove all those, and then remove the cable for the hood latches as well, so you can get that out of the way. And then while you're here, we're also going to remove a plastic cover. Now the E60 has this nice engine undershield, and this tends to soak up or at least deflect a lot of the oil that builds up when you have an engine oil leak. So as you can see here, the subframe and just everything around the power steering pump and alternator, it's all soaked in oil. So we're going to be fixing that today. But at the same time, like I said, we're doing the oil change, and just by draining it, we're just reducing how much oil is going to fall out of the hoses and out of the gaskets as we service them. So I'd recommend you guys do the same thing if you don't mind spending an extra $100 or so on the oil supplies, but otherwise you might just need to do a quick top off if you're not doing an oil change. So depending on which package was equipped with your E60 550i or 545i, you might have an oil cooler that's built into the fan assembly. So to remove the fan, you actually have to remove these two oil lines first. They're pretty easy to remove, they're easy to access. Just be careful because they're gonna have some residual oil in them that's gonna spray on you as you remove the line. Now with that taken care of, we can actually start to remove this electric fan assembly. And first things first, the electrical connector is off to the left hand side, but then as you pull this thing up, you need to go ahead and fold the arm on the right side inwards so that it clears the radiator hose. And then as you pull it up, be careful because it's going to get stuck on all the hoses and wires at the front of the engine. And now, of course, we're going to go ahead and remove the belt because, of course, to get the alternator off, we have to have the belt off first. And then right below the alternator, there is an idler pulley that we're gonna have to remove. Also, we end up removing the tensioner later, but I'll show you guys that in an upcoming step. Now here I'm showing you the 2 bolts for the alternator. They're pretty easy to access, and once you get those free, you're gonna pull the alternator out. Just remember that as the alternator comes out, it's still gonna be connected to the hot power wire and the voltage regulator connector. So be sure to remove that connector, and then it's a 13mm nut to get the electrical line off the back of the alternator. You're gonna pull it out of its position first and then remove these connections so that you can lift it out of the car. And yes, mine was very, very dirty. We also need to remove the power steering pump, but once you get the bolt and the nut loose that hold it in place, you're just going to let it dangle at the front of the motor here, basically in front of the subframe, and that's going to give us all the room that we need to service the alternator gasket, but we don't have to remove the lines for the power steering pump and remove it completely. Next up, we're going to remove the nut that's holding the motor mount to the motor mount arm that's on the engine, because in the next step we're going to be lifting up just this side of the engine so that we relieve the pressure on both of those components, and we'll be able to remove the motor mount arm as well as the engine mount itself. And also, while we were up here, I went and removed the 2 bolts that hold the motor mount to the subframe. Alrighty, so as you can see, we were able to remove the 2 bolts holding the power steering pump on, and able to kind of move it down and away from everything, so that now we have a really good look from the bottom side of this alternator gasket plate here. And there's like a thermostat, like an oil thermostat at the back there, which has the 2 oil pipes that come out of it. So we need to get those off first, then that thermostat mechanism, then we need to get the motor mount off. And I already went and loosened obviously the 16mm nut that holds it to the arm so that we were able to get a little gap there, but I think that realistically we're gonna have to leave the motor mount in there because I already took off the bottom bolts as well and I can't get it out yet. So I think we're gonna leave the motor mount there while we remove the arm off of the engine block, and then we should be able to pull out both pieces and be able to get that alternator plate off. So that's what I'm gonna try to do now. Probably gonna have to use a few wobble extensions, but I think once we do get those 4 bolts off, we can get the motor mount arm out of the way, and then we'll be able to service that gasket. So let's go ahead and get back to work. Now it's really tight to film in here, but I'll just show you guys. We're removing the oil lines first, and those are held in by just 1 bolt. And then next up, we have to remove this thing. It's the oil thermostat on the side of the alternator bracket here. And this controls the flow of the oil in and out of the motor to the oil cooler, but it's in the way of the bolts that we need to remove for the motor mount arm. And as you can see, once we remove all 4 of those bolts, we have a lot of play in it, enough that we can actually get the engine mount out of the subframe completely. And that gives us enough room to access all the bolts so we can start to remove the alternator bracket. All right, so we have got our prize here, the alternator bracket, it's called. And here's what it looks like up on the side of the motor. You see these 2 ports for the oil valve, which goes to the oil lines to the oil cooler in the front of the car. And immediately I noticed that these things have like some aftermarket RTV on here. I thought this was just oil, but this is clearly like black aftermarket RTV, which means that this was probably serviced before at some point, but they didn't replace the O-rings, and so because of that they probably used some RTV to get it sealed in there, I guess. But that is probably the biggest contributor, I'm thinking, to the oil leak. Just look at how wet it is around here. I think it's running down on this end. But again, we do have the replacement O-rings, so we're gonna be using those for both sides on the front and the back of this thing. Another thing is I noticed that we have some buildup along the front here. See, like it was coated just with dirt, you know, dirt plus oil equals this black sludge stuff. And it was this bolt right here to the timing cover that I noticed was loose. And you know what? There's actually oil in the bolt passageway that goes through that front timing cover. Now I think that because it was serviced before, that bolt was probably not torqued to spec, and because of that it started leaking oil. And that's apparent when we look at the bottom of the motor here. You see what I mean right there? That bolt with all the oil dribbling off of it, that's the one that goes through the timing cover, and I'm sure that it was under torqued, and because of that, it was leaking oil down the side of the motor here. And then here's the passages for the alternator plate gasket, and that thing, that alternator seal, I don't know if it was leaking or not. I mean, like I said, it was probably replaced before, cleaned up. Doesn't look like it was leaking too much, but definitely a lot of this coming from the timing cover from that corner up here, and I think it was just coating the alternator bracket plus those RTV seals, which clearly were not working well. It's definitely wet down there on like the steering rack and stuff like that, but this is not just oil from our work today. This is like miles and miles worth of oil leaking onto this part of the subframe here and all the way back the car and just all over this side here. So of course we need to clean everything off here in the engine bay with some brake cleaner. Same thing with the alternator bracket here as well. Definitely we want all this looking really fresh. Replace this seal, replace the O-rings, and also the O-rings on the oil lines, which are still held up by a bracket on the side of the motor here. So let me go ahead and do that, replace all these seals, and then we'll install this bracket and go over the torquing procedure. So now I figured that we would go over the torquing procedure for this alternator plate because it's a little bit different than a typical gasket. Now you do have two different size bolts here. These larger ones are the M10 thread. So these are going to be for the back of the plate, as well as the two bigger bolts, or the 4 bolts for the engine support arm, which go over this portion of the plate. Then you've got these smaller 13mm bolts, and this is an M8 bolt. So these have different torque values, and you'll notice that there's more of these smaller bolts on the front. There's another 13mm, 13mm, and then this is the Torx one. So anyways, the bigger bolts get torqued down to 38 Newton meters, including all the engine support arm bolts, and then the smaller ones get torqued down to 21 Newton meters for the timing cover, as well as for the side of this plate right here. Now, since the bigger bolts are under so much pressure, I'm not so worried about that sealing action, but we noticed that the timing cover was leaking, and I think that this 13mm bolts right here was probably under torqued. So we're gonna go ahead and make sure we get this thing torqued first, these two bolts actually, because they're vital in creating that seal on the upper timing cover, and then we'll move to the bolts that are on this side of the plate. So this side first, and then this side, torque down this bolt up here in the corner, then put the engine support arm in, and then we'll be good to reassemble with our new alternator, do an oil change as well, and everything, which is basically the reverse of removal. So now we have got the engine lowered and it's resting on the motor mounts, the motor mount arms, and the alternator bracket, which is fully torqued down to spec. And I'd say probably the most difficult part of this procedure, it wasn't actually installing the alternator bracket, but getting the motor mount arm and then the motor mount itself lined up, because there's actually like this line here and it goes on top of the motor mount. So you have to kind of get the bracket on top of where the bolt goes through. So that's probably the most difficult part. Took me a couple tries, but now that everything is torqued down, like you see the motor is in its place, I'm gonna go ahead and install this alternator right here, brand new. It's gonna look really nice in there. Everything else in the engine is cleaned as well, so we don't have to worry about a lot more oil buildup. Probably wash off with some pressure washer next time I clean the car. And like I said, once I get everything else together, I'll do the oil change, go ahead and top off the oil. And this is something you N62 guys should check out. It's called Motor Oil Saver, and I use this on my old 550i. And after, I think, 2 oil changes, I really noticed a decrease in the amount of blue smoke coming out of the tailpipe, which is common for the N62 motors, which have valve seals which tend to leak, and there will cause that oil to burn through the exhaust. So I'm going to do some of this oil treatment preventatively. I haven't noticed any blue smoke out of the back of the car yet, but we're going to go ahead and use that motor oil additive because I think it's going to make a big difference on this car, and it'll help prevent that issue from arising in the future. So that's going to conclude our video for today, and I would go ahead and take you guys through the rest of the repair, but it's just so time consuming. This job is honestly a 2-day job, I would say. If we're putting it into hours, probably 12 hours, I would say, conservatively, and it's taking me a little more time because we're filming it, of course. So like I said, just a little bit more work, we'll have everything back together. Insulation is the reverse of removing it. And if you guys have any more questions, be sure to let me know with a comment down below, or if you have any tips for this job, be sure to let us know. So drop a like if you enjoyed the video and subscribe if you haven't yet. And as always, I hope everyone has an amazing day. We'll see you next time.